What is up, down, and sideways, all you stunning individuals? It is another Ambient League Unlock here. More with you guys to go through the nostalgia chamber and also the preview chamber, although that's a little less hype, but we're looking at the best underdog runs in world's history, the true stories of David versus Goliath, and going on 15 world championships now. There's a lot to choose from.
This has got to be part of your task list that you're checking off as you get prepared for the World Championship, is always taking a trip down memory lane, revisiting some of the stories of old that have gone through, and especially some of the upset stories of old that we have had through the scene, some of these miraculous underdog runs that have come through and set the table for what is possible, what not to write off in your mind heading towards this next World Championship, knowing some of the incredible feats that we have seen happen before.
And seeing as the entire West is usually an underdog, we've actually got some NA and EU pride to get through here. And we start with some of that combo of NA-EU. This is Cloud9 circa 2021 at the World Championship. And if you recall, this is the Perks era, jumping in the mid lane with Sven. This is the 2-4 tiebreaker madness between a choking FPX and an NA versus EU rivalry against Rogue. But remember, to even qualify for this World Championship, Cloud9 lost the tiebreaker for first place to Detonation Focus Me, had to play an extra series against Peace to even qualify for the main event.
This was messy. This was sloppy all the way around. Not just the performances of Cloud9. I think you can group almost the entire international stage at that point into what happened at this event for it, because yes, it is not a good sailing early on from this Cloud9 team. They do have that matchup against that Nation Focus Me, doesn't go their way. Underperformance, sloppy performance all across the board everywhere. This is the multi-million-dollar deal to bring Perks into the mid lane for Cloud9, with the expectations all aboard with that money coming on through, and not delivering so far at this event. Struggling, underperforming, looking, not interested almost at certain points. Very much so was heavy criticism, heavy pressure put towards this Cloud9 squad, all to that important final day of the event.
And obviously, this is a group of death. You have the defending world champs in Dom1, Kia, and FPX, who many people had as a top three to win the entire event heading in here. So yeah, nobody was picking a Cloud9 that struggled a little to get out of the play-in stage. And 1-3 going into their last matches after losing a heartbreak to Dom1. They beat FPX, they beat Rogue back-to-back, including the tiebreaker where within a single game, you have the microcosm that was Perks on this Cloud9 roster, where he's inting and getting a game-winning pick in, a span of 5-10 minutes.
It was all over the place that day, what you got to see. And again, you're holding on to your seat at that point as a Cloud9 fan because of that record that you'd already set yourself behind in that point. And frankly, actually looking back on this now, this might have been the moment that broke Rogue. There's a lot of things that went wrong and ended up with a broken Rogue for the LEC. I think this is one of the things that kickstarts all that problems, all the things that go wrong, is just having this disruption, having this falter and failure against what is a Cloud9 that had underachieved, was underachievers at that point throughout this event, still finding a way to push through in that final day, setting up everything on the table for them.
Cloud9 obviously, then goes on to get completely smacked by Gen G in the quarterfinals, but doesn't matter. Top 8 performance, they advanced, and absolutely nobody was expecting that era of Cloud9 to get to that point. A little bit of EU love for number 6 on this list, and this is, I think, even if you weren't paying attention around this time, this is a memorable series that I think a lot of people have gone back and revisited, and that is 2017 Misfits. This time it's NA suffering the wrath of a tiebreaker loss to EU, as Misfits, they weren't in a group of death, but they were in the group of life that was supposed to be free for World Elite and TSM to get through, but Misfits had very different ideas.
Yeah, very much so. Not a group of death situation, but one of those ones where Misfits, your position within the group was to face death, was the way the expectation was for this team, knowing, what people thought of TSM, Flash Wolves, and what was going to be there. Misfits made it very different, and they made it very different right from the very get-go of this group stage and what they were able to throw out and show down. And specifically, though, it is that tiebreaker match where, to me, there was almost no question. This wasn't a very close game, and one thing goes the one way or the other. It was a dominant show from Misfits to say, nuh-uh, TSM, no chance. It is us moving on forward. And then the effort we get from this Misfits team against SKT, arguably to me, is the greatest underdog performance. It only can be, I think, one of these ones where we're going to go through the rest of them on this list, talking about what your personal flavor of what you want in the upset or in an underdog type of matchup. Because for me, this is almost as good as it gets with how the Misfits were able to push SKT and really one or two mistakes away from being the one to put down SKT at the event.
Yeah, probably the greatest upset that didn't happen, but was really close that people talk about because it was the sheer fearlessness that Misfits played in this series. This is the two-time defending world champion SKT coming into the lineup that's revamped with Peanut and Huni. But of course, we all remember the infamous Blitzcrank out of Ignar, and then the Fervor Leona 2v2 against Bang and Wolf in the bot lane with, I think it was the Vayne Lulu comp that they ended up putting together. But those are obviously the two main memories I think people have from this series.
Yeah, and you're certainly, that Blitzcrank is a big part of it. That was absolutely one of those ones where it is, and it still is, that gamble of a pick. If you're hitting your hooks, you've got value. If you're not, you're actually negative value to your team because of what you can't provide, what you're not offering, what other simply traditional picks would provide. That was one of those type of risks that you took, and you saw the payoff time after time again. Hitting those hooks was Ignar. I think as well, you're looking at Power of Evil. Alfari were big power players on this team. Unfortunately, I think Maxlor is kind of the only guy whose career didn't really pick up or continue all that much success after this point. But still, one of the best underdog stories that we have ever seen at the World Championship.
The only organization we got twice on this list comes in again at the number 5 spot, and that is Cloud9 circa 2018, which Blabber's the only guy who was going to be on both of these squads, and Blabber wasn't really playing in 2018. This is the Sven, Scare, and Blabber kind of switch, but Sven was getting most of the starts. And similar to that 2021 Cloud9, they barely even qualified for the main event. They needed Game 5 against Gambit in the play-in stage to even make the main event.
This was a struggle bus for Cloud9. This was a very up and down, topsy-turvy type of year, a year that saw replacements come in for Jensen and Sneaky at certain points in the year, as well as Smoothie in the bottom lane, and eventually it stayed as that replacement in that bottom lane. Zazel was alongside Sneaky towards the end of this run. Of course, Licorice in that top side, going back to this era of Cloud9. It was that run of the 6-man iteration, the jungle experiment, Svenskeren and Blabber, but really more so was that dominant showing of Svenskeren more often than not, what you were getting from this Cloud9 team. And you're right, it was cutting it close to even make it to the event at that point, getting that Game 5 win over Gambit.
And I think, again, another group of death. We've got to reiterate, you have the defending world champs in Gen G. I know they end up going 1-5, but still, it's the returning guys who just dismantled the SKT dynasty. And of course, RNG were far and away the overall tournament favorites heading into this event. And Cloud9 proceeds to pick up games off of both of them and even force a tiebreaker against RNG to finish first. They were one team fight away from finishing first in this group of death.
That's the actual real crazy thing about it at the end of the day when you are looking at that group. And I think, yes, a bit of it is kind of, the surprise of the 1-5 Gen G at that point that were the defending champions. But I think, again, that's one of those ones where it's more so, well, did you really do the deep dive into the Gen G roster at that point and kind of where the motivations, where the power levels of these players were? You could have made a better guess type of situation. But certainly with the power that RNG had at this event and what they had shown throughout the year, for a Cloud9 team that struggled at that point to even get to this part of the event to showcase and show out and only be that one fight away really was something impressive.
And then, of course, they proceed to go into quarterfinals and get like the first ever LCS best of 5 win against an LCK team as they 3-0. I'll even say stomp a Freak of Freaks in that one. And of course, this is the infamous Licorice Ornn auto attack Baron Steel.
I was fortunate enough to be there in person to see this go down for Cloud9. It was a pretty epic moment again.
At the
I'm sure the only guy screaming or crying more than me was Kobe on the broadcast for this one, the way it was for Cloud9. But this was a great moment for North America. It reaches quite a train wreck of an ending, I think, when you look ahead towards that semifinal matchup and how things played out. But absolutely, hanging our cap on getting the quarterfinal win against the LCK for sure.
It's a similar trajectory for the number 4 spot here, and we're going 2015 Origin for that one. And the reason I got this one ahead of Cloud9 is you could say that the Freak of Freaks Gen G underperformed, RNG underperformed, no question. Origin was more surprising and taking down, again, a group of death that had KT Rolster, LGD were the first seed out of the LPL. They end up getting out of this group over TSM as well. We'll throw them in there. But Origin were in the challenger scene in spring, right? They complete the full run, losing Game 5 to Fnatic in the summer finals. But in the start of the year, they go from challenger to making it to the semifinals of the World Championship against SKT. That's crazy.
I think one of the most important things about this was really it opened people's eyes to the idea that, you know what, there is talent outside of these Asian, regions, outside of just Korea and outside of China. There is talent, and it doesn't have to be the talent that is always at that very tippity top tier of competition. You got to find it a little bit deeper. You got to really take a look, because you can find your own diamonds in the roughs, and that is exactly what this Origin roster built themselves out of, rising through that challenger scene, as you talked about, all the way through from the beginning of the year to reach a point where you are in a group of death and you are making it out. You are putting the pressure on these big time organizations. That was something that we hadn't seen at that point at all throughout the history of the game. And so I think this one is that one, and really the, kind of debut birth, welcome onto the scene truly for me with the EU. And when you were seeing it up against what we then had to realize was the powers, those monsters that existed within the LCK and LPL. Very happy that we get to talk about Origin here.
And obviously Fnatic was also in the semifinals of this event, but Fnatic were a powerhouse. They weren't an underdog. People were expecting a semifinal berth for them. That were the legit expectations. Origin was not the same level. This is rookie Niels to become Sven, and then it really did feel like Expecte and Soaz turned back the clock to absolute vintage performances to get them to semifinals. So I think the level that Origin was playing at was much higher than people were anticipating, and that's why we got them ahead of that Cloud9 circa 2018. No question when you get into the top 3, we're going beyond the West and entering into wildcard territory. The first squad to get out of groups when groups was still the formatting in 2016, Albus, Nox, Luna, who got wins against both CLG and G2, eliminated them from the group stage, and even got a win against Rox Tigers. Yes, this is the same Rox Tigers who had the 5-game banger semifinal series against SKT. And again, Albus Nox got to a tiebreaker to finish first over Rox. They ended up losing that, but again, something that if you predicted that before this tournament, you would have been clinically insane.
Yeah, and I still think you're clinically insane. You're going to that type of route. This was absolutely one of the most wild ones that we have ever had come through, and certainly one of the biggest upsets in the history of the World Championship to have Albus Nox make the run that they were able to go on. I think this is one of those ones that is, of course, so famously remembered by the inspirational speech from Liquid talking about, never giving up, always trying everything else, and it doesn't hit quite the same now that we know a little bit more about his toxic history and everything else.
Kind of ruined this one for us.
Doesn't hit exactly the same, but still one of these ones I think we're, kind of putting that aside. You're looking at the accomplishment, the achievement, what type of expectations were on this group. You cannot ignore Albus, Nox, Luna, and have to throw them in here. As you talked about the series against Rocks Tigers, and again, that's a Rocks Tigers that is one of the most storied lineups in all of the LCK at that time, and what they have gone on to do in their career since then. So yes, this is one of those important ones that I think is very much so one that you got to hit in the history books.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about guys that are all-time levels in their roles on Rocks, right? When you talk about Smed, Prey, Peanut, Gorilla, and a wild card team in 2016, it hits different than nowadays because there were zero expectations. Getting like a win against an EU or NA team was like, wow, you got to win. But getting out of groups was unbelievable.
There's opportunities now for wildcard region teams to get the competition, to get that exposure to what type of talent level it has to be risen to when you're on the international stage. Not like we used to have back in the day where it very much was, well, you either made it to Worlds and you got an opportunity or you didn't. And you didn't get to play against anybody until you hit the stage next year, and it was still going to be only the domestic competition. So, yes, got to give credit where credit is due. This was absolutely one of the biggest underdog stories, and especially the underdog of underdog stories of the time.
Still not cracking the top two on this list, though, because in the 2 spot, we got one for the old heads or the historians of LoLesports way back to Season 2, 2012. Yes, we're talking about the Taipei Assassins, who were really the first and OG underdog run. They came into the tournament with a bye to quarterfinals as the first seed from Taiwan, whatever the league was called back in 2012. I think it was just LMS. But they had a bye where they had to play Najin Sword, who had just leveled up in the group stage. This had Prey and Machnoon proceed to beat them 2-0. They beat Moscow 5, who were pretty much the consensus best team at the world then, because Korea hadn't fully leveled up yet. And then they, of course, beat in the infamous Azubu Frost series in the finals, 3-1. Again, they were massive underdogs heading into those finals.
This was one of the craziest ones, and it's one of those ones where I think a lot of people's only connection to it is the skin line that is left over, and I think not a lot of them
and the Ignite video, the 5-second clip, yeah.
Give them the Ignite video, yeah, that's always a banger for us, but certainly I think the skin line, and it's only from the association of going, yeah, that's an esports team, and this is the skin that was around it type of thing.
It's
You're
not the
really
best
even
skin
going.
line. That's for sure.
It's not as team flavored as the skins have become with the color coordination and everything.
They were
that's gone
figuring it
through
out still, how to make these skin lines, you know.
The ideas behind the skin line is something that I do like seeing with some of these ones, and how it incorporates and is in the line with esports type of things is always a fun thing with that. But yes, this was one of the greatest upsets on underdog stories, and it still is one of those ones that we continue to talk about at this time because it ends up with a championship at the end of it. It is the ultimate of underdogs achievements, making it that full run all the way through. You mentioned it, even against, Najin Sword, you're looking at them as the underdog. You're going against Moscow 5. You're still underdogs against what was the best team in Europe at that time.
They reverse swept them, by the way, out of 5, Moscow 5, so...
And then even in the finals against Abuzu, you are still those giga underdogs. Go to the Ignite video and see how much they were stacked up against, looking up against the Giants, the Frost Giants on the other side. Not enough. Toys and the boys find a way to power up and push through and get the big underdog championship.
They were, probably number 1 on this list for a long time. But a decade, really, you would talk about. But now... I'm not more confident in any other stat or ranking in the team in number 1 being locked in forever, because I don't see anyone ever usurping the underdog run that was DRX in 2022.
It's going to take a lot to get past this one. And when I say it's going to take a lot, it's going to take a lot of what your grading is for an underdog on the team scale. And then it's going to be what you accomplish, and what you had to do to accomplish that is going to be the next part of it, because these things both got to line up if you want to surpass this DRX run. Because, boy, let me tell you, this was one hell of a run from this DRX squad. And it starts before the World Championship to even get to the World Championship. Going through the gauntlet run, going through Juhan as the starting jungler most of the time, getting Pyosik in there, whatever type of combination it had to be. This DRX run all the way through to become the world champions against Faker and the T1 Dynasty really is something that is spectacular.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for having to be locked in since the gauntlet stage, right? Of the LCK, because it's do or die elimination. They have to go through play-ins to even get through. They're the 4th seed from the LCK. Even when they qualify, nobody's picking them. Maybe they make quarterfinals. That's as high as they'll possibly go. It's Def's last dance. And then, of course, we all know how it plays out, but we just got to reiterate the gauntlet that they go through. This is the most anime storyline script that we have ever had at a world championship, because you have Deft playing former teammates all the way along the EDG series against Scout and Mako. The inhib respawns in game 2. They have to reverse sweep to even win that series. Then he goes up against his pal Chovy in the semifinals, and of course Kyria on T1, his best pal in the bot lane, in the finals. It really felt like you were watching a TV show.
You can't script it any better than this. You really can't. And the fact that it just happened the way that it did, as you laid out, the EDG facing off against the LPL, the inhibitor respawning and everything else, the drama of all that. Then, of course, Gen G, the expected champions of the event, or at the very least, finalists of the event. So to throw them down, absolutely one of those ones. And then, of course, to stand in the way of Faker and T1 getting a championship. Nobody would have been predicting something like that. Never mind a squad like DRX leveling up and getting the heroic performances they did from Zeka, from Kingen throughout this tournament to make this type of run. Absolutely the most special underdog story I think we have ever seen and will ever see in League of Legends.
Especially because it was the hardest road. There were no easy series. There were no easy games for DRX. They had to grind out this entire tournament, game 5s, reverse sweeps, and Guma Baron steals that they have to survive multiple times. The entire path was just an absolute journey, pilgrimage, whatever you want to call it. There's no way any underdog story will ever match what we got out of DRX in 2022. But that is it today for League Unlock. Eric and Mark here with you. Absolute beauties. Thanks for hanging out.